Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Strevens. He's professor of philosophy at New York University. He works on the philosophy of science, where his interests include explanation, complex systems, probability confirmation, the social structure of science and causation, the psychology of concepts, and the philosophical applications of cognitive science. He is the author of the book we're going to focus on today, The Knowledge Machine, How Irrationality Created Modern Science. So, Dr. Strevens, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Okay, great. So let's start with a bit of background here. Was there science before the so-called scientific revolution?
Well, there was certainly inquiry into the kinds of things that scientists are interested in, the way that the world works, the way that matter interacts, how minds work, how life has a place in this physical world. And so in that respect, yes, there was science. But before the scientific revolution, it was done in a rather different way. The scientific revolution marks this moment when the whole method, if you like, of science changes in a remarkable way, and we get something that we would call modern science, or that we could simply call science. It doesn't really matter what you call it. The important thing is there was this great change in the way that these questions, which remained the same, were being answered.
Right. But do we know why science, or at least the scientific revolution, took so long to occur? Because, I mean, we have written history for around 5,000 years now, but the scientific revolution only occurred around 500 years ago.
Yes, I think that's a great puzzle that I try to answer in my book. So you look at someone like Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who's living more than 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years before the scientific revolution happens. And he is very much interested in all of those questions I was just laying out, and many others besides. Really just about any question a scientist might ask today, Aristotle was interested in finding the answer to. And he's using many of the same tools as scientists use today, looking around, making observations, formulating theories that explain what he observes. He's very systematic and deep in his thought. He's very creative, but also very rigorous. It's hard at first to see what he could possibly be doing wrong. And yet, I'm not so much here thinking of the ways that his theories fall short of the truth. I mean, even science today isn't right about everything. But somehow, in spite of his incredible accomplishments and his brilliant books, science as such just didn't really get started. You have centuries and centuries after Aristotle, you really don't have anything that looks like progress in the sense of building incrementally on what's known. Until the scientific revolution, when you really begin to get that kind of progress, you really get the huge ramp up in knowledge of the way the world works that has made the world we live in look so different from the world 300 years ago.
But I mean, before the scientific revolution, we already had disciplines that we associate with science, like, for example, engineering, medicine. But should we classify these as scientific?
Well, like I say, it does depend a little bit what you mean by scientific. If you mean inquiry, trying to answer certain kinds of questions, then absolutely yes, they are scientific, and many of Aristotle's writings are scientific, as are the writings of other ancient Greeks or medieval Islamic philosophers, for example, as well as writers in other parts of the world. So you have an interest in these scientific topics, but you don't have this particular way of doing things which I associate with modern science and which seems to have made all the difference. So again, I don't want to lay down the law on how to use the word science. That's that's not such an interesting question. The interesting question is, whatever you call it, what changed to make inquiry after the scientific revolution so much more effective?
Right. And is there a scientific method? I mean, is there one single method that is used across all sciences?
Well, there's something. I mean, in that you look at different sciences, and of course they're different in many ways. In some sciences, experiment is crucial, and in other sciences, it's almost impossible. Think of what cosmologists do, thinking about the Big Bang. They have to rely to a great extent on simply observing the universe. So there's huge methodological differences across the sciences, and philosophers of science and other thinkers interested in the way science works have found it very difficult to put their finger on something that all those sciences have in common. In particular, to find, for example, a common kind of logic by which evidence is brought to bear on theory, in which evidence, however it's acquired, is used to tell us which are the good hypotheses and which are the less good hypotheses. Even that's turned out to be very difficult to find for, I think, principled reasons, which we now are beginning to, in the last 100 years, we've begun to understand. Nevertheless, as I implied when I talked about the effect of the scientific revolution, I do think something very important about the way these questions are answered. So something very important about the method that scientists use really did change with the scientific revolution and is shared by all modern sciences, however different their equipment, their apparatus, their statistical methods, their ways of reasoning may be.
Mm-hmm. In trying to understand or to answer the question about how science works, I mean, historically we had several different philosophers trying to answer this question. I guess that last century we had two very prominent ones, Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. So what do you think about the approach put forth by Karl Popper first? I mean, trying to understand the scientific method as a sort of method of falsification.
Well, I think that both Popper and Kuhn had some real insights into what was the reason that science had been so successful. And in my book, I try to build on those insights. I think Popper and Kuhn and I all think, as do many other philosophers, historians of science, and scientists themselves, that the key to modern science is its ability to extract from the world very telling kinds of evidence and to bring those, to put those pieces of evidence, which are often matters of surprisingly small detail, to put them at the center of arguments about which theories are right and wrong. So let me begin by saying that, just to kind of to foreshadow what all of these thinkers, including my own thoughts, are going to have in common. Then I can talk a little bit about what makes each thinker distinctive. So Popper put a lot of weight on the idea that evidence was able to falsify theories, to definitively falsify theories, meaning to prove them false. So if a theory makes a prediction, we go out and make an observation, and the theory clashes with that observation, it predicted something else instead, then we can throw away the theory. We know it's wrong. And he thought that this kind of mechanic was at the heart of science. Now, there's something right about that, something that strikes a lot of scientists as being right about that. But as Popper himself knew, it's not quite that simple. And here we sort of start to approach the issue of why it's so difficult to formulate a logic of scientific testing or evaluation. No theory really ever makes any direct predictions about what's going to be seen out in the world. And to make what seems now to be an obvious point, one that Popper was well aware of and discussed in his writings, you perform an experiment, and I discuss a whole range of them in my book, a bunch of different examples, and the result comes back and it's not what you're expecting. But it's not necessarily the theory that went wrong. Maybe there was something wrong with your measuring instrument, especially when you're really making these very precise measurements of little things that where so many things could easily go wrong with the measurement. So I discuss early on in the book the case of Arthur Eddington's famous test of Einstein's general theory of relativity, where Eddington and his team were making observations of a solar eclipse. And what they were trying to do was determine exactly how much the gravitational field of the sun was bending light rays. So it turned out that Einstein's theory and Newton's theory of gravity, which was being replaced by Einstein's theory, made different predictions. But the way those predictions turned up was in differences in the apparent positions of stars around the eclipsed sun, which on the photographic plates that Eddington and his team were taking correspond to differences of far less than a millimeter. So these are tiny, tiny differences. And you imagine the camera attached to the telescope just shaking a little bit. And it will easily obscure these little differences that are supposed to tell the difference between the theories. And in fact, when Eddington brought his photographic evidence back from the places where he was doing these tests, 2 different locations, one off the coast of Africa and one in Brazil, they didn't all give the same results. They gave different results. And Eddington looked at these and decided that some of the results must be wrong because the measuring instruments were wrong. Well, some of them must have been wrong because they simply contradicted one another. So he was able to argue successfully, although actually, as it turned out, quite controversially, that one of his telescopes just had something systematically wrong with it. Okay, so you get a especially when you're measuring these tiny little things, you get something that's a little off from what you were expecting. You can always say, well, maybe it was the measuring instrument that's off, not the theory. And the truth is, as every scientist who does experiments, makes measurements of this kind of thing knows, often it is the measuring apparatus that's wrong. In fact, usually it's the measuring apparatus that's wrong. So it's not so easy to decide to throw away a theory when you get a bad prediction. And what Popper ultimately did not really succeed in doing, although he tried, was giving a method for deciding when to blame the measuring apparatus and when to blame the theory. So this is something that scientists often do, although they argue a lot about when they're doing it right and when they're doing it wrong. And Popper, although he wanted an objective principle for answering questions like that, wasn't able to provide one. Mm-hmm. So that was the shortcoming in his theory, which nevertheless was certainly looking in the right direction.
Right. Can we say that science is value-laden in any way?
Well, yes, and that's exactly the right question to ask, really, because it turns out that the reason it's so hard to write down the objective rule that Popper was looking for is that it's not really there. When scientists are making their judgments about whether to trust the measuring apparatus or to trust the theory, or in the case of Eddington's conflicting observations, which measuring apparatus to trust, if any of them, the kinds of considerations they bring to bear are often very painstakingly and intelligently, nevertheless inevitably depend to some extent on questions that where there's going to be differences among different scientists. So some will think, well, this particular apparatus is terrifically reliable, and often it turns out that that's the apparatus that they were brought up on, as it were. It's the one that was used in their lab that they learned to use really well. So they have a certain kind of affinity or trust for results from that apparatus, where they have less trust of some other kind of measurement technique or apparatus. And in a situation like this, what's really affecting their judgments is something that's kind of personal. You know, it's a kind of a value judgment. You know, these aren't political or ethical values, but it's still a opinion about the world that is fixed in the way that value judgments are fixed by loyalties, affinities, personal experience, and so on. And I don't think it's a bad thing that these judgments are affected in this way. In fact, I don't think there's any way of coming to these judgments without allowing these factors to partially play a role. And so it's inevitable, really, especially in the early phases of science, when you have conflicting results coming in from various different places, or even the same place, like Eddington's 2 telescopes in Brazil that gave him different readings. It's inevitable that you're going to make judgments that, in a very broad sense, are value judgments. Actually, the case of Eddington is a very nice case of this. He was, in this case, there wasn't a difference in the kind of method. It was really just 2 telescopes that were lying right next to one another, giving different results. But he was very much a proponent of Einstein's theory. He loved the theory for its mathematical beauty. But he also was a proponent because he saw in the vindication of Einstein's theory the opportunity to move beyond a really quite considerable rancor that had built up, because this is all happening in 1919. So the First World War is just over, and there was a lot of nationalist feeling still, and in particular a kind of if you like, a Cold War between science on one side, let's just call it British science, and science on the other side, let's call it German science. And Einstein was very much on the German side. He was Swiss, but a German speaker, or at least he was working in Switzerland. Anyway, he represented German science, and Eddington saw an opportunity here in vindicating this beautiful theory that a German scientist had created, or German-speaking scientist had created, to essentially to promote world peace, a very worthy aim. But his biographers, people who have written about this research much later, have thought that he was certainly inclined to lean towards the telescope that was providing him with results that made Einstein look right for these reasons. So that's a way that his values, quite admirable values in this case, were affecting his judgment. And I think, like I say, these kinds of situations are inevitable. It's impossible for science to resist them, and they shouldn't. It's just a natural part of human reasoning that when we have these complicated situations, we have complicated decisions to make, and we don't have anything close to full information. Eddington couldn't go back and look more closely at the telescopes while the measurements were being made to see whether something might have been going wrong with one, because at the time they were too busy making the measurements, and later on it was all over. The eclipse was done. So he just had to make a judgment call, and scientists do that all the time, and values come in, all kinds of values, all kinds of, more broadly speaking, subjectivity comes in making these decisions about what the evidence shows.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how do you define rationality, irrationality in this case, in the book? Because as the subtitle suggests, you're trying to make a case for how irrationality created modern science, right?
That's right. So we've been talking about the ways in which science is subjective. And I think some defenders of science think that at least too much of the subjectivity is itself irrational in a way that undermines science. Now, in my book, I say something really very different, which is that there's a certain irrationality to science which actually, far from undermining it, is the secret. It's the thing that came in the scientific revolution that makes science work so well. The kind of irrationality I have in mind, though, has nothing to do with the subjectivity of science. As I've said, I think the subjectivity of science is inevitable. It could be, if it were taken too far, it could be irrational. If we just ignore the evidence and choose the theory that we like best, that's a bad kind of irrationality. But that's not what you see going on typically in science. Eddington was not ignoring the evidence. He was interpreting the evidence in a certain way. But he was certainly paying attention to it when he said, I think there was something, these 2 telescopes can't both be right. Something went wrong with one of them. That was rational. That was logical. And when he decided to trust one rather than the other. What he did was not irrational. It certainly wasn't dictated by the rules of logic or by the rules of rationality. It was more like a subjective decision, although one that was connected in complicated ways to the facts on the ground. But it wasn't irrational. So that's not the kind of thing I have in mind when I say that science is irrational. And I know I'm delaying a little bit about in revealing my own view, but that seems appropriate. So I don't think the subjectivity in general is irrational unless it's taken too far. So I don't think science is irrational because it's subjective. However, because it's subjective, you are going to find a lot of disagreement in science about how to interpret the evidence, and it is going to be inevitable. I'll stop there. I know I haven't quite answered your question yet, but maybe you want to, you can encourage me and I'll go on to answer it. I just don't want to carry on for just Nate.
Yeah, sure. I understand. So, yeah. Okay, so I mean, regarding how science works, I mean, how does it work exactly? Why is it so effective in knowledge production, and even from a pragmatic point of view in terms of the things that are developed through science and work? So what would you have to say about that?
Right. So what is this thing that came along in the scientific revolution and made such a huge difference to our ability to fathom the secrets of nature, that I'm saying is, in one respect, kind of irrational? Let me by going back to an earlier question you asked me, as well as talking about Popper, to talk about Kuhn. And what I'll do is I'll say something about Kuhn's ideas that I think is really incredibly insightful, and which is the insight that I build my own ideas on. And here's what I'm thinking of. Kuhn realized that it was important, extremely important, not just how scientists interpreted the evidence, how they used it to evaluate theories. It was also really important to modern science how they generated the evidence in the first place. And one thing that made it terrifically important is that these little details I'm talking about, these little details that are often what really makes the difference, and ultimately in the sense that it's these little details that tell us it's Einstein that's right, Newton after all is wrong, or details, for example, of they're not just details of measurement, but details of very fine-grained structure, like the molecular structure of a molecule like DNA, show us how inheritance works, or at least begin to show us. These tiny little details are often incredibly difficult to actually measure or to observe. I've talked a little bit about the difficulties Eddington had. So it actually requires a huge amount of time and effort, and above all patience, to uncover these details. Eddington's team going off for their one-shot chance at observing these eclipses, and maybe the weather wasn't going to be so great. In fact, it wasn't so great where Eddington was, or the kinds of years and years of preparation, building a very expensive apparatus to observe events that are over in a flash, for example, something like the particle accelerator at CERN in Switzerland. But many other kinds of painstaking observation as well. I have some entertaining examples in my book, but I won't go on and on about them now. These all require from scientists incredible commitment to sometimes years and years and years of work, to observing little things that on their own don't really matter that much. It's only because they can function as evidence that they matter so much. And Kuhn realized that there was something very important about the institutional structure of science, important in motivating scientists to devote so much effort to uncovering these little details. Now, he thought that what was really important was that when scientists were at work in any domain, there was a kind of a fixed ideology. This was his famous paradigm that governed all of their work, and which they never questioned. And because they didn't question it, they're actually able to get much further than the scientists who had some self-doubt or philosophical, reasonable philosophical concerns, or even just empirical concerns about the framework. But the framework was completely fixed. They didn't question it, so they were able to just charge ahead and do their experiments. And they didn't care if it took them 10 years to set up the apparatus. They were going to measure this tiny little detail no matter what. And it's a great story, and there's something very right about it. But it has turned out, as we've looked more closely at the way scientists actually work, that it's not true that they're so imprisoned by the paradigm. They do question it all the time. So there's something a little bit wrong about Kuhn's story about what's actually pushing scientists to what gives them the energy that they have to get up in the morning and go and run their apparatus one more time, even though it hasn't worked for the last 3 months, which is completely normal in science. Okay, so that's what I take from Kuhn. I think what's key is something that in a way is a little bit simpler. It's this, that science is set up, if you like, as a kind of a game. I mean, a very serious game with a very with a point that goes far beyond the game, that is figuring out how the world works and making it a better place. But there are certain rules of the game, and if you're a scientist, you have to follow the rules. And the rules, the paramount rule is something I call the iron rule of explanation. And this is a rule that says, and this is going to sound very obvious at first, at least when I spell it out, a rule that says, in doing science, you must pay attention to the evidence and only to the evidence. Okay. So first of all, if you're going to argue with other scientists about whose theory is right, which of course is what all scientists want to do, or even with themselves, because they want to figure out which of several different theories they're curious about, which is right. You must do it by creating evidence that distinguishes between the theories. Okay, so science is always a matter of finding evidence. That's a part of what explains why scientists are always in the lab, if you like, or always behind the telescope. But also, you can only do it that way. And this I think is something that every scientist knows this. They're raised to do it this way, but we don't always appreciate the significance of this and the ways it makes modern science different from, say, what Aristotle was up to. So you must not frame your arguments, for example, at all ever in philosophical terms. There's no point where, as a scientist, you're allowed to sit back and say, well, I got these conflicting measurements from my two telescopes, so let me find some other way to compare these two theories, Einstein's theory and Newton's theory. Eddington was, as I've said, greatly drawn to Einstein's theory simply by its mathematical beauty, its elegance, the fact that it eliminates the strange coincidence in Newton's theory that two different things, inertial mass and gravitational mass, are always exactly the same. I know not everyone who's listening to this is going to understand what I'm talking about, but that's the kind, if you do, then you understand a little bit of the beauty that Eddington saw in this theory. So you might imagine Eddington say, okay, well, the eclipse experiment was a bit of a mess, but here's one thing that we can all recognize, that Einstein's theory is more beautiful than Newton's theory, and we should go with Einstein for that reason. Eddington could have argued that way, and that's the way someone like Aristotle might have argued, or someone like Descartes, even writing in the 17th century, right as the scientific revolution was happening. There's a kind of a attractive, philosophical, big ideas sort of aspect to that way of thinking, and also it saves you from years more of hard work making measurements of eclipses. But the iron rule, this rule that I think is at the heart of science, says, no, you're not allowed to do that. It's not that Eddington isn't allowed to think these thoughts to himself. He is allowed to think that Einstein's theory is more beautiful. He's allowed to be motivated by that thought. But if he wants to argue with other scientists, he can't say, we should prefer Einstein because Einstein's theory is even more beautiful than Newton's. He has to go back and argue about the evidence, or ultimately Eddington and all the physicists that followed him have to go back, and if the results are confused, make more measurements. And this is in fact what happened. Eddington was actually quite successful in manipulating people into trusting him when he said, this telescope gave the right answer, but not completely successful. And some scientists, especially outside his immediate ambit, so astronomers in the US in particular, he was English, operating in England. So US astronomers, back to tribal affinities again here really, were standing outside this whole thing. We're a little bit more dubious about Eddington's argument in favor of the Einsteinian results. The upshot ultimately was not that the question was resolved by these kinds of philosophical arguments or aesthetic arguments, but that people spent a whole lot more money and a whole lot more time going and making more measurements of light bending during eclipses. There were decades and now actually it's hard to find the right kinds of eclipses. You need the sun, you need not just a total eclipse of the sun, but one where there are some relatively bright stars in the background when it's happening. And that's actually rarer than you might think. So it took decades to do more of these measurements. It was very expensive. It was very time consuming. But the iron rule said, no, you've got to go back and do more measurements. That's what happened. Now we know. Now we have good reason to think that when you make these measurements, then you get the results that Einstein predicted. And that's how, because of that and various other experimental observations, some of them even more expensive and time consuming, we now think Einstein was right, or at least more right than Newton. So it's the iron rule's insistence that we always go back to the lab, or back to in the case of observing the eclipses, it's not the lab, it's back to the telescope, back to the measuring apparatus, that forces scientists, if they want to play the science game, to spend so much money and time making tiny measurements rather than making philosophical or aesthetic arguments, or back in the day theological arguments to distinguish between theories. And that has turned out to be the way to really make progress in answering these questions. So there's my answer. I haven't gotten to the irrationality part yet, I know, but there's my answer as to what really distinguishes modern science from, say, Aristotle, and makes modern science so much more effective than Aristotle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, scientists could gather data all they want, but how do they decide what is the correct interpretation of a particular set of data? Because, I mean, is there something out there, something that is attached to the data that tells us how to interpret it correctly?
The short answer is no. And there's no point at which you can say, okay, now we have enough evidence. We can finally make up our mind that Einstein is right. If you look at the history of these measurements that are supposed to test Einstein's theory, what you see is more and more evidence comes in. We never really find out. At first, the evidence can be quite confusing, and people simply differ over how to interpret it properly. Typically, we never find out why it was so confusing. We don't really know what went wrong with that telescope of Eddington's that gave the results that looked more like what Newton predicted. Presumably something went wrong, because we're pretty confident now that Einstein is right about these things. But we never really find out what went wrong. We never resolved those disagreements that Eddington had with the American astronomers, for example, in the sense of actually all coming to an agreement about the right thing to think. Instead, because scientists keep having to play the game to dig up the evidence, more and more evidence comes in. And as more evidence comes in, opinion tends to shift as each particular scientist brings their own constellation of values and loyalties and inclinations and maybe just cognitive and emotional tics to the question of judging the evidence. Then when things are working out, now they don't always work out, but when things are working out, there's a gradual convergence of opinion on one theory rather than another. But there's no point at which we can say, okay, now finally science has discovered that this theory is right and this theory is wrong. At no point is there really, if you look closely, often agreement on which are the most important experiments. So you can at a point where scientists are largely agreed about what to say about some particular concern, they may not be so agreed on what the really important results were in reaching that agreement. So the more deeply you look, the more low-level disagreement there is, but there is still ultimately a kind of convergence, a kind of consensus. And at some point, although it's not a particular point, if you see what I mean, we can say, okay, it seems like the balance of opinion is now firmly favors Einstein over Newton.
Yeah, and would processes like replication play an important role here? I mean, could it be that by replicating different experiments, we get a sense of how we should interpret the data that come from them?
Absolutely, yes. So those repeated measurements of eclipses are, in a very broad sense, replication. I mean, it's not really exactly the same experiments, of course, but it's the same kind of thing. And what you're doing is you're going back and doing it again. And this time, you maybe know a little bit about what went wrong with the apparatus last time, and you can take further precautions. So Eddington wondered if perhaps with that telescope in Brazil, maybe the heat of the sun had caused a mirror that was a part of the essential apparatus to expand and distort in some way. Now, that mirror was sitting right next to the mirror that was giving different results from the other telescope, so this is not in any way a straightforward claim to make. But still, if you're worried about the mirrors and the heat of the sun, you can maybe do something to cool them down a little bit. You can't shade them because the whole point is they're taking in the light from the sun, but that's something you can try to do a little bit more better, control it a little bit better the next time around. You can just hope for better weather, and take various other precautions. And so through this process, you simply get more data. As I say, you may never find out. You do never find out what went wrong with the last time around, but the weight of evidence begins to build up and begins to look like it's clearly favoring one theory over another, or at least often does so. Sometimes if you just have some deep false belief about what's going on, then your experiments may continue to give confusing results. You still don't know what's going on. And this happens all the time in science. I was just reading some recent data about the measurements of the diameter of the proton. And it's beginning to look like maybe we have some convergence there, but it's still a case where different methods of measuring give different results, and nobody really knows what's going on. So you don't always get convergence. Hopefully we will eventually, but it's not some kind of inevitable thing.
Mm-hmm. And what is the role that peer review play in this process? I mean, because is it the case that by submitting findings to review by other people that are part of the scientific community renders this process more objective?
Well, I think peer review has many benefits, but the one that's maybe the most important and certainly the most germane to this conversation is that it enforces the iron rule. So the iron rule says only evidence and only evidence, and a reviewer looking over a paper is looking to see that rule is being followed, so that the paper is not simply making an appeal to some philosophical merits or an appeal to beauty. Typically, papers won't do this because everyone knows the rules already, but the peer review keeps scientists on track here. More specifically, typically, now here we have to look at different fields differently, but at different fields or even just different forms of experiment will have very particular methods that count as bringing evidence to bear, certain kinds of statistical testing, for example. And so what the peer reviewer is looking for is an effort that's been made in the paper to do things according to these particular rules, which may differ from one domain to another, which do differ from one domain to another. But in effect, they're looking to see that the rules of the game are being played in a certain appropriate way, and those rules are saying, here's what counts as presenting evidence for or against a particular theory. So I expect some of your listeners, some of your viewers will know what null hypothesis testing is, for example, where there's a certain hypothesis that's a rival to the one that you're really interested in, and you try to show that that hypothesis makes bad predictions. And there's a whole rigmarole for doing this. And it's when you follow that rigmarole, that counts as presenting evidence of the appropriate sort, and thereby following the iron rule. And a peer reviewer will be looking to make sure that these rules are being followed in the right sort of way.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, could you now answer the question of why science is an irrational process?
Yes, absolutely. So now I want to say, of course, I don't want to say it's a completely irrational process. There's actually a lot of careful, logical thinking that goes on, and a part of it is, in fact, in just what I was talking about, the construction of these rules for deciding what counts as evidence, and the reviewers making sure, the journals making sure that research that's published follows those rules in the prescribed ways. So that's all very methodical. It's pretty objective in many ways, in the sense that there's an objective matter of fact whether you're following the rules. So what's irrational about all of this? As I say, it's not the subjectivity, although there is still subjectivity. None of these rules actually tell you that the evidence supports a theory or not. What they really do is they simply qualify something to count as evidence, to count as the kind of thing that can be published. Even when people say things are statistically significant, they're not saying that they support a hypothesis or undermine a hypothesis. They're just saying they follow the rules, so they count as evidence. Scientists then look at the evidence, and each scientist evaluates it in their own way. That's always subjective, but that's not what's irrational either. Okay, I'm finally going to tell you what is. What's irrational is ruling out from scientific argument everything other than this kind of evidential thinking. So I'll give you an example. And it's one I've already discussed. Eddington, as I say, thought there was a certain elegance to Einstein's theory that counted in its favor, that made it, that gave us reason to believe that Einstein was right and Newton was, and therefore Newton was wrong. And we find, if we look at the history of science, scientists often privately to themselves think these thoughts, and in fact these thoughts are really actually quite important to progress in science in many ways. So in the book I discuss, for example, as an example, Murray Gell-Mann's development of the ideas that led to the whole theory of quarks, the idea that particles like protons and neutrons are actually made up of more fundamental particles, the quarks. And Gell-Mann got to this result. Gell-Mann and other people who had some of the same ideas that he did, reached these conclusions in part by looking for elegant structures that would systematize the otherwise very confusing phenomena that particle physicists had been uncovering in the years after now the Second World War, so the 1940s and the 1950s. And quark theory was developed in the 60s. And Gell-Mann says, and it seems this fits very well with everything we know, that it was very important to his reasoning to be able to distinguish different kinds of mathematical structures, and he was especially attracted to the more beautiful or elegant or symmetric structures, and these gave him his ideas, not just his ideas, but a certain kind of confidence that he found the right answer. And there's a great story about this moment when some new information was coming in, yet still more particles had been discovered, and people were trying to arrange them in ways that had some kind of system to them. And Gell-Mann stood up and showed how they all fit together into a certain structure, but that structure had a missing part. And that missing part would correspond to a particle that no one had discovered yet. Everyone went off to look for that particle, and sure enough, just a year later, they discovered it. So here was Gell-Mann had the confidence to get up and make that prediction because he thought this, in a sense, the structure is too beautiful not to exist. So he was really convinced, and many other physicists are also convinced, that these considerations of elegance and beauty are actually very important and useful guides to truth. And they use these as guides to truth. Okay. However, the iron rule says the journal editors, the peer reviewers say, you can't say that in a journal article. You can't say that in official scientific publication. You're not allowed to appeal to beauty. If you look at Gelman's papers, you'll find maybe one or two passing remarks, but no attempt to argue on the grounds of elegance or symmetry that the theory must be right. Instead, all the arguments are based on empirical evidence, as the iron rule says they must be. And like I say, this has been incredibly fruitful by sending people back to the lab, back to the observatory, to bring in more and more carefully made measurements. This is where scientific progress has come from. But there's a certain sense in which it's unreasonable, which is this. It's saying, in the scientific journals, so I'm finally getting to the irrationality of science. In the scientific journals, you should publish your evidence, which makes a lot of sense. That's highly rational because the evidence is so important in finding the truth. But you must not give any of these arguments from beauty, even though you personally are convinced. And we have, I think, good empirical reason to think that the right kinds of aesthetic thinking is actually a powerful consideration in favor of a theory. So the iron rule is telling you to ignore reasons that you believe are good reasons. And actually, I think we have empirical evidence are good reasons, these beauty-based arguments, and pay attention only to the evidence. And that is technically irrational. It's saying, in making your argument, ignore things that are good reasons, that would contribute to the argument in useful, good ways. Ignore, if you like, ignore relevant considerations. Ignore powerful, relevant considerations that will help you find the truth. That's what the iron rule will say. And that, I think, is unreasonable and irrational, but because it sends direct scientists back to the place where really 99% of the effort, the sweat and the tears are needed, it makes science a far more effective inquiry procedure than it would be otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And these considerations that science tells us to ignore, are they intuitive, and that would make science counterintuitive?
Yes, I think so. And I think this gets back to the question you raised right at the beginning of why it took so long for science to come along. Why didn't Aristotle adopt the iron rule if he was so smart? Well, he was really smart he was probably as creative, original, and rigorous a thinker as has ever existed. But the iron rule would not have made any sense to him, and I don't think it would make sense to anyone who thought deeply about it and who wasn't in the position we're in, which is to be able to look back at 300 years of following it and see how successful it's been. Someone like Aristotle, who had no empirical reason to think it would be good. It's this rule that says, pay attention to the evidence. Okay, that's good. Aristotle himself thought it was crucial that theories be consistent with all the evidence. In fact, that they explain everything that is observed. So that's good. But then to say only the evidence and nothing else, to rule out considerations of beauty, elegance, philosophical harmony, for thinkers later on, like a thinker like René Descartes, who was for whom theology and God were an important part of his thinking about how humans in the world all fit together. To rule all of that out would have seemed ridiculous. Highly, not just counterintuitive even, but obviously stupid, right? And so someone like Aristotle would have thought, I'm going to look at the evidence, of course, but I'm also going to do my philosophy. I'm going to throw everything at these deep, complicated problems that I can. And so it simply did not occur to him that there could be any benefit to just focusing purely on the empirical side. Ultimately, I think because it took a long time to appreciate just how important these tiny details are in sorting out the truth.
Mm-hmm. So in the book you talk about 4 different innovations that made modern science, and I think that there's one we haven't touched on yet, a distinction between public scientific argument and private scientific reasoning. Could you explain that?
Yeah, well, I've alluded to it without kind of laying it out. So I was talking about how, on the one hand, someone like Murray Gell-Mann, the quark theorist, or Arthur Eddington, who was thinking about Einstein and relativity. On the one hand, they considered beauty to be very important and used it as a guide to deciding what was right and what was wrong. And on the other hand, they were forbidden to actually talk about it in their publications. And this whole way of talking implicitly makes a distinction between two kinds of argument, if you like. Now, one kind of argument is the argument that goes on in your own head, as it were. You're in your lab, or maybe you're just sitting in your armchair late at night, having come back from a long, hard day in the lab, or you're all of your calculations are in front of you. You're scratching your head, wondering what it all adds up to, and you're thinking to yourself, what should I believe? What are the fruitful avenues of inquiry here? What experiments might it be good to do? Who's right and who's wrong? In that kind of personal interior argument, the iron rule puts no constraints on that whatsoever. You can appeal to beauty, you can appeal to philosophy, you can appeal to God, you can do a tarot reading. I'm not recommending that, but it's not. The iron rule says I'm not concerned with that. You can be a good scientist, and almost anything can inspire you or guide you toward the truth. However, there's another completely different kind of argument where you must follow my prescriptions, and that is what I call public scientific argument, or it's probably better to call it official scientific argument. And what I mean by this is argument that's made in the official channels of scientific communication, the scientific journals, and in some sciences, conference proceedings are also very important as well. It's really those channels. So nothing else actually counts. It doesn't. What a scientist writes in a book that they write for the popular press, what they say in a TV interview or a podcast. Iron Rule says none of that matters. You can talk about how God has inspired you, how beauty has inspired you, go for it. But when you publish in the journal, you must not mention any of that. It's got to be just the evidence. So the distinction here then is between the official scientific channels of communication where the Iron Rule applies and where only appeals to evidence may be made, and everything else. Both private in the sense of going on in your own head, and unofficial in the sense that it's not part of the standard way that the scientific establishment records all of its evidence, which is, of course, this is the place where scientific knowledge lives. So when the Iron Rule says, "I only apply here," that's a pretty important application. This is the place where every scientist actually makes their case as a scientist. So really, it's tremendously important that it's restricted in such a tight and, as I say, technically speaking, irrational way.
Mm-hmm. So, since science can only appeal to, or scientific arguments can only appeal to the results or the outcomes of empirical tests and not things like philosophy, for example, how do you look at the relationship between philosophy and science?
Well, on the one hand, there's the question of how science, as it were, organizes itself, where philosophy is strictly banned from scientific publication. So anything that's considered philosophy or philosophical is out of bounds. Again, scientists are able to think about it in their spare time, or they can even chat about it in lab meetings or with their scientist friends, but it's simply not allowed in official publications. And we see some scientists sometimes like to make disparaging remarks about philosophers. Another thing I talk about in the book, and I think the function of those remarks is actually to to perform this kind of social policing of the scientific literature. So although as a philosopher I don't particularly like being disparaged, nevertheless I think these remarks perform a positive function in that they keep the literature pure. Now you might also ask me though, yeah, but what? So that's the way the rule works. What do you think? Do you think there should be more philosophy in science? Could science benefit from being opened up a little bit to philosophical considerations? Well, I'm kind of torn actually. You know, on the one hand, I think it is truly, there is a sense in which it's irrational to keep philosophical considerations out of science insofar as they're relevant. Now, most of the time they're not relevant. But for some issues, like for example, the question of what quantum mechanics is really telling us about the world, how to interpret quantum theory, philosophers have done work that's at least as important as scientists. And so there are some places where philosophy really could be quite helpful. And it's hard to say, and nevertheless, scientists should ignore it. And I don't want to say that. Nevertheless, I think to myself, and yet the way that this is the whole message of my book, is that science has been successful because it has sometimes resisted the call of reasonableness and said, no, we're not going to have any of that. Back to the lab, keep measuring, don't get caught up in these questions. Of course, if a few scientists get caught up in these questions, it's not going to destroy the scientific institution, so it's not an all or nothing matter. But I think maybe it is a good thing for, we philosophers can as it were, work on these questions, and we can communicate with science. We can influence science through the back channels by influencing our scientist friends. But we should continue to support the enterprise of keeping philosophy out of official science.
Mm-hmm. So can we say that science rests on a set of not empiric, but epistemic assumptions that if people decide not to accept them, then they don't have to accept the knowledge that science produces?
By people, you mean regular people or scientists?
I mean, all people, basically. I mean, if there's a set of epistemic assumptions that people have to accept beforehand, if then they are to accept also the results that come from science.
I think there's not a, as I was saying earlier, there's not really a point at which you can say, okay, now everyone has to accept this theory as opposed to that theory because of the evidence. There is a point though where it does strike us as rather unreasonable to resist the evidence anymore. Perhaps the most important thing to say here is there's not a point at which science has some logic or calculus where it can say, okay, we just crossed the threshold. It's now no longer reasonable to reject, let's say, the thesis that humans have created a lot of global warming over the last few decades. It's just no longer reasonable. We just got to the point where we can say it's proven. There is no point like that. Nevertheless, I don't mean to say that the evidence doesn't show anything. To some extent, in science itself, what happens is each scientist looks at the evidence themselves and brings to bear their own personal complexion of beliefs and to some extent biases and so on, and makes up their mind. And once the evidence, once there's enough evidence, there tends to be a certain kind of consensus. So the individual scientists who are well informed and paying attention, the ones who actually work on this stuff, will tend to, through their own personal interpretation of the evidence, will more and more agree with one another, as has happened in climate science. So at least on a straightforward assertion about the existence of human-made global warming, you now get the vast majority of climate scientists agreeing. But that doesn't solve the problem for the ordinary person, or even for a scientist in a different discipline. They're not in a position to evaluate all the evidence. There's just not enough time to do that. I mean, not even close to it. So they have to some extent, find a guide. If we're going to have an informed populace. And I think, and what's needed is something actually, when necessary, we need to put the kind of resources that we've put into the case of climate science, creating in this case, the UN body that is basically in charge of, whose job is to interpret the evidence for ordinary people. And by ordinary people, I mean everybody who's not a climate scientist. So this body, the IPCC, is a group of scientists who come together, and what they're doing is, in effect, they're doing something that scientists normally do not do. And in fact, this whole enterprise exists outside of science. It's run by the UN, which is not a scientific body, the United Nations. But what they do is they try to apply, if you like, a sort of a reasonable, middle-of-the-road scientist's epistemic background beliefs to the evidence, to come up with what a kind of reasonable middle-of-the-road scientist would say given the evidence so far. And what they're offering is a kind of a guidance to the general public, saying, yeah, there is now overwhelming evidence, and they have a more specific language for saying these things. There's now overwhelming evidence that humans have created an amount of global warming that's at least this great. But in effect, what they're doing is, as I say, they're taking the temperature, the epistemic temperature of the scientific body itself. Yeah, and that's the most we can do. But for things like this, it's desperately important that we do it. Of course, these are issues that really are going to make a huge difference to the future of humanity. But it has to be done in a way that, falls rather short of what we might hope for, which is somebody coming out and saying, okay, science has now discovered that such and such an amount of global warming has happened, that the causes of this and that and the other thing, and the consequences of this, that, and the other thing, unless we do these things. That is just, that's if anyone ever says that, they're more than just oversimplifying.
Yeah. So does this way of thinking about how science works you present in the book have anything to say about the demarcation problem? I mean, and the way and how we can distinguish science from pseudoscience?
Well, yes, it does. So the demarcation problem of what counts as science and what counts as something else. Now, one kind of something else is pseudoscience. Another kind of something else is philosophy. Another kind of something else is the natural philosophy, things that Aristotle did before modern science began. It's the iron rule that makes the difference. I think the iron rule, it's when a process of inquiry follows the iron rule, making this really somewhat artificial distinction between a public scientific argument and private reasoning, and then imposes on public argument this requirement that it must all be carried out in terms of empirical evidence and nothing else. That's when you have real science. That's why what Aristotle did, however admirable it may be, isn't real science in this sense. That's why philosophy is not real science. The case of pseudoscience can be a little tricky, because often in pseudoscience you find people assuming the trappings of science. So a good example is the kind of creation science that has been developed in this country, the US, where I am, to get around the court's ruling that the doctrine of special creation, that all the different groups of animals and plants were created by God, to get around the ruling that can't be taught in schools because it's a religious doctrine. So the creation scientists have tried to create something that looks as much like science as possible. So obviously that creates problems for demarcation. And, it could be that creation scientists are listening into this very podcast and writing down, okay, we have to follow the iron rule. And what you may get then is something that kind of looks like science, but there's a certain kind of bad faith in the sense that that the whole thing exists not in order to create a open process of inquiry to find out what's really going on, but to simply to create something that looks exactly like science, but nevertheless is created simply in order to reach some preordained conclusion. It's tough though, because individual scientists do things that are a little bit similar. So you take someone like Eddington. I don't think Eddington was a complete dogmatist by any means, but he certainly had something that was a little bit like a preordained conclusion. He was definitely looking to prove Einstein right, and he definitely engaged in some special pleading in some of his work to get there. So even though I gave you an absolute black and white answer about demarcation, the practical question is not necessarily going to be so straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one final question. Earlier I asked you if science is value-laden, but when we think about science, usually we think that it's a descriptive enterprise. I mean, we're trying to understand how the world works and things like that. But can science sometimes be prescriptive, or is that something that only morality and ethics can deal with?
So you mean morally prescriptive in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll give you a short answer. No. In fact, I mean, what I've been saying is science can't even, in some sense, can't even be epistemically prescriptive. It can't say, here's what you should believe. In order to get a prescription like that, you have to create an additional body like the UN's IPCC to say, okay, we've looked at the science and here's what you should believe. Likewise, although scientific knowledge may bear in certain ways on moral questions, presumably it does. For example, the question of say of how people with various kinds of mental illness should be treated in society, what level of responsibility they can assume in various ways, in various circumstances. A question like, for example, to what extent should we allow an insanity defense in the courts of law? Science is going to certainly have some bearing on answering those questions. But there will have to be, if you're going to get any kind of prescription, some kind of intermediate body that on the one hand is informed enough about the science to actually go and read the scientific papers like a scientist would read them, but it also allows a certain other kinds of information to flow into the deliberation in a way that science would not. So we need a kind of a moral body. And we do, of course, have things that function along those lines. To some extent, courts of law do that, although some legal theorists think they ought not to be morally deliberating, and some think, don't be ridiculous, of course that's what they're doing. Then we have political bodies, of course, which are more are allowed to reason a little bit more morally. Either you have think tanks that exist outside of government, and then also bodies that are set up, advisory councils that are set up by the government, and the government itself is to some extent such a body. But that's the way it's going to be. Science will always scientific research will always have to be mediated by these other organizations or groups if it's going to issue prescriptions, not just about what to do, but even about what to believe.
Okay. So just before we go, again, the book is The Knowledge Machine, How Irrationality Created Modern Medicine. Would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find you and your work?
Yes, well, my main conduit is simply my website, Strevens, my last name, .org, O-R-G. So that's a place to look into all the various different kinds of things that I do. Uh, uh, that's about all I have going on right now on the web. But you will find this not only links to my more professional philosophical work, but also to some of the public writing I've been doing, to podcasts like this, and so on. So I would suggest for more strevens.org.
Okay, I will include that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Strevens, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. It's been great to talk.
Uh, Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. So the channel is now 3 years old, and to keep it running it's important to have your support, and so I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there. Any amount starting at $1 would be a great help. Otherwise, you also have PayPal. The links are all in the description box of this interview. And if you like what I'm doing, please share this interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karen Litzke and Blanchett Pereira Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Eric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windaga, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Please, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffinia, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.